The CMS Migration Expert Series is brought to you by the Center for Migration Studies of New York. Loren Landau is the South African Research Chair on Migration and the Politics of Difference at the African Center for Migration and Society of the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg in South Africa. He also serves on the editorial board of the International Migration Review, a peer-reviewed publication of CMS and the premier interdisciplinary journal for international migration, refugee movements, and ethnic group relations. Dr. Landau sat down with CMS to discuss his recent research into so-called urban estuaries that challenge how scholars traditionally view human mobility and governance. In places like Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, and Maputo, Mozambique, these estuaries on the peripheries of state authority are giving rise to novel forms of political community, institutions, and ethics that Dr. Landau argues will characterize the future of African urbanism.
Right. I've been working with this sort of metaphor of the urban estuary, which is drawn from, I guess, oceanography or natural sciences, but it's an effort to try to capture the way in which people live in cities and the kind of character of certain spaces, whether it's an inner city or on the outer edge. And it's spaces where, in this era of mass migration to urban centers, you have a kind of odd pattern of migration and urbanization. So it's people coming in, not necessarily coming to stay in a place. So others have talked about these as gateways, but gateways suggest a sort of one-way motion into the city. And what we see in a lot of places is a kind of what Deborah Potts and others have called an incomplete urbanization, where people move into the city, they move back home, circular migration, oscillating migration. But I think it also captures this idea that there's a sort of churning even within the city. People move from one part of the city to the other. This is a response to enormous economic precarity. They don't have permanent jobs, they don't have necessarily permanent housing, so they're moving around, they're trying to find their way in. And the result is you get these whole neighborhoods, sometimes large parts of cities, which are very unstable. And you can see that as chaos, but I think that leads us to miss a lot of what's going on. There are forms of belonging, ways of being in those spaces, which are potentially distinct. And that's a lot of my research is trying to understand what those spaces are all about. Yeah, I think when we look at migration, especially in the global south, in post-colonial context, we have countries that are highly ethnically diverse, often where you have a kind of weak history of political or social consolidation at a national level. Domestic migration and international migration are often indistinguishable. I mean, you'll see in some places, international migrants might have co-ethnics or others in the city already, which allow them to integrate in a way that's far better or far more effective than people coming from another part of the same country. And so in a lot of the research that we've done, we see that international migrants tend to do better economically. They tend to do better, over the long term. Some of that is a selection bias, but some of it is also a sort of, a recognition that there's often for domestic migrants, the ones who come, the ones who are in slums, are the politically marginalized. They're already on the edge. They're highly disadvantaged. So it suggests that there's a need to dissolve some of those barriers, I think, between the discussions of domestic and international migration. I mean, if we look at the history of urbanization, at least what the written history, a lot of it builds on models from the Industrial Revolution, mass urbanization in Europe, later in the United States, where people came in largely to work, or came into a kind of quite strong political system in which they were integrated, shown their place, not necessarily an equal place, usually a certain type of class fragmentation, but they're there doing a job, or they're doing something else. What you're seeing now is urbanization with neither a strong state nor strong economic opportunities or kind of formalized economic opportunities. You're seeing this also in countries that are themselves highly diverse politically, socially, economically. So while France was not France or Frenchmen, until urbanization happened, they came to the city and became Frenchmen. They're integrated into a political system, into an economic system. If you see people moving into, whether it's Peshawar or whether it's Nairobi, they're not getting those opportunities. They're coming in, making their own way, not incorporated into the economy in a formal sense, not incorporated into the political system. And that, I think, allows both fragmentation but also alternative forms of sociality and politics to emerge. I mean, I think historically, if you look historically in New York, there's definitely things like this. If you look at Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, there's a lot of the same sort of political fragmentation happening. The state was much weaker, the economy was less able to absorb people, but ultimately you had a stronger state and a stronger economy, which brought those people together. That said, what we're seeing in many cities, especially with the decline of formal employment, the decline of long-term employment and mass immigration from a diverse place, is neighborhoods that are somewhat disconnected both from the formal economy, or disconnected, obviously still part of, but also on the margins. And I think if you look in London at the riots in London, on the banlieues of Paris or parts of New York or American cities, you'll see neighborhoods that are starting to look more and more like this. I mean, these are just ideas that I'm playing with, but I think what within migration studies, there's been a move to understanding that there's connections often across borders, and this is a sort of transnational turn. For me, that still doesn't get at sort of the specificity of space that we need to be talking about. And I think for our analysis that I've been doing, you start to see these neighborhoods, with very specific characters, often in close proximity to each other. So in Johannesburg, you'll see a giant sort of emergent slum that 15 years ago was a field, literally was a farm, which has now 100,000 people, right next to a neighborhood which is a sort of gated community of wealthy people, Gulf estate. Those sorts of areas look very different, and there's these sort of islands, social islands, but to speak of them as islands ignores the fact that they are deeply connected. The slum provides labor and for the wealthy area, and so there is a connection, and this is why I sort of see them as a series of neighborhoods that are connected. But also further afield, what happens in those slums has direct impact on neighborhoods or villages or communities potentially across a continent or even across the world. The money that's earned there, the sort of social forms that are generated, have a direct impact on the places that these people are from, but also on the places where the diaspora exists. And so I think we can see these archipelagos at a sort of local level of connected neighborhoods, but also as a more diasporic area. But that it brings attention to the role of these specific neighborhoods, whether it's the village or whether it's the urban estuary or neighborhood, as sort of connected chains of social, economic, and kind of political spaces. It's a good question, and it raises a broader question of whether inclusion is what people are after, or if they are, what kind of inclusion. A lot of migration studies, particularly in the US or Europe, focus on integration. It takes a baseline of a local population, what is their access to education, health status, infant mortality, etc., and judges whether migrants are achieving that, whether they're participating in politics, whether they're on the school board, whether they see themselves represented in the culture of the place. In these sorts of spaces, there's a few questions that come up. The first is, who is the local population? I mean, a lot of these spaces are so new, or they've grown so quickly, that the owners or the original indigenous population are so outnumbered that they're not able to really effectively serve as a baseline. Secondly, because people don't really want to stay in these spaces. We ask people, where will you be in 2 years, in 5 years? Almost no one wants to be there. They may be, they're stuck. But there's a question then of what kind of integration they want. They want to be there, they want to be able to use the place, but usually to get somewhere else, whether it's back home, part of the other part of the city, another country altogether. And so we've been talking about what people are after there is not kind of full representation, full political membership, but usufruct rights, the right to use the space so that they can get what they need and move on. And this raises a whole range of questions about the nature of politics, the ethics of being with each other. But these are things that are happening, and the ways of being and integrating or belonging that are being negotiated at a horizontal level in very different ways in different sites. Well, I think that there's different ways in which people claim rights, and again, keeping in mind that the kind of rights they want vary. Some want a more traditional, they want to become citizens, they want to vote, and that remains quite state-centered. But elsewhere we see that even when you have full documentation, you don't have rights. People will not allow you to live in a place, they will not allow you to open a business, they will not allow you access to healthcare. In those sorts of spaces, rights are negotiated at a sort of spatially defined level, and sometimes you can access things which you're not legally entitled to, either because you're co-linguistic, or you can offer a sort of exchange. We see that people negotiate with the police, they turn them into their police, where they create a strong social bond, which means that they can have rights to residence even when they don't have formal rights to residence. But we're also seeing rights being claimed through things like the Pentecostal church, where people find a form of recognition, where they are appreciated for who they are. But it's a rights that is, if not post-national, it's sort of post-terrestrial. It's that you are here, you have a right to take what's yours because God wants you to have this. But you have no obligation to the people around you, and in fact you should disconnect from the people around you because they're possessed, or they will bring you down, or they're working for Satan. And so there are these different modes of rights, sometimes very pragmatic, sometimes very spiritual and otherworldly. And these are the sorts of things that challenge both how we think about the power of law, what kind of rights people want, and particularly the mechanisms by which people are included or excluded from the places that they live. Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges. The first is, that, as I was saying before, across much of the world, that distinction between immigrants and migrants, or domestic migrants, often needs to be dissolved. And that if you're talking about building a city or a space that is inclusive to outsiders, that distinction often doesn't matter so much. But I think it also causes us to rethink. In practice, we do think of immigration policy as something that's top down. But like all policies across much of the world, those policies might be there on paper, but are not, and they may structure what happens on the ground. But I often think of the state in these places as a sort of weather system. We're all aware of it. We get annoyed at it when it pours on us. We enjoy the sunshine. But it doesn't change how we work. It doesn't structure what we do on a day-to-day basis. And if we're talking about immigrant integration, if we're human rights activists, if we're policymakers or refugee activists, we need to start thinking about, is it local chiefs? Is it local gangsters? Is it real estate developers? Is it, churches? Is it, especially these sort of Pentecostal churches or mosques? These are actually the actors that include or exclude. And how we engage them, how we incentivize them is something that we have to really think through. But there's also, I think, a new ethics, that we talk about integration as statement. It's part of a political imaginary. Places like the US, France, people will come, they'll become part of us. I think we're increasingly recognizing that there is a sort of multiculturalism there de facto, and that's unlikely to go away. Most of the sort of political philosophy or ethics we have around integration works from the presumption that there is a host population, It's very much a metaphor of hospitality, where you're welcoming someone into your house, and there is then some sort of negotiation between the two of you about the rules, about how you know, when you wash the dishes, you know, these sorts of things. But ultimately, that those rules are set more powerfully by the person whose house it is. And that may still work when we talk at the national scale, you know, where there's a citizenry and there's international migrants. But when we start to look at the actual mechanisms of integration, we realize that this is something that is, integration is something that's negotiated at a much more micro level. And in those spaces, it becomes less clear whose house it is. If you have a place I was speaking before about Deep Sloot, or Rongai on the edge of Nairobi, or a number of thousands of other places, which 20 years ago were fields, or were areas with 10 or 20 people doing subsistence agriculture, and are now cities. Who is it that sets, it's not a question of who has the right in some ethical sense, it's who has the capacity in a practical sense to set the terms for engagement. And in that space, it's an ethics where there's no host. There's no one who says this is mine. There's often no one who wants to claim this as their space. And I think that raises a whole range of other ethics about how do you live, whose place is it, what rules do you follow, and who has the power to set those rules. I think what we're seeing in these margins, whether, you know, there's been a lot of literature, for example, in the United States, on culture of the ghetto, if you want to use that term, or, you know, of the politically marginalized spaces. And there's often a presumption that those spaces will remain on the outside of the mainstream politics. But I think the demography is working against that. I mean, the ghetto, as it's been traditionally understood, may not be growing, but something comparable to that, these kind of archipelagos of different sorts of neighborhoods and different sorts of socialities, are growing to such an extent that mainstream politics, the sort of central core of the state, may just simply be overwhelmed. And I think across much of the world, this sort of mass migration has occurred at a time when you have both radical decentralization of the state, so the state itself has become fragmented, and in many places a weakening of state structures, where the state has become less involved in the economy and service provision, etc. And so it creates a lot of opportunity for these alternative politics to emerge. We've often seen radical politics emerge on the margins of society. If you go back to biblical times, Christianity emerges on the edge of the Roman Empire or elsewhere in the world. And I think that there are movements that are taking shape in these places which will come to redefine societies. And if you look at, for example, the Pentecostal churches, you see the Brazilian churches, the Nigerian churches, the others, penetrating Europe, coming into the United States and setting up new social orders. Is that going to overthrow or change the government of these places? Probably not in the short term. But I think it is creating other movements. Elsewhere, it's Al-Qaeda, it's Al-Shabaab. These movements are also taking hold in these neighborhoods. And if something is going to threaten the political order of the West, it may very well be those sorts of movements. Yeah, I mean, I think that the time has come, let me say, for the immigration scholarship to lose a little bit of its focus on the issues that have been defined by the experience of integration or immigration into the West. And I think it's easy now with the sort of European refugee crisis, if you want to call it that, to continue to think that migration to the West is the defining issue of politics and scholarship. But if we look at the movements of people within China, for example, that's reshaping a country which represents, what is it, a fifth of the world's population. Immigration within India or between India and Bangladesh. These are millions of people, and they're generating new social forms, new economic patterns, new political shifts. And I think we need to shift and understand these places, not as sort of patterns that are going to follow the way in which immigration, urbanization, migration happened in the West, but as different processes in and of themselves, and to start theorizing what that means. And being based in South Africa, even if I'm not South African, has opened my eyes to that there is a need to shift the way in which we do research, and it's been very exciting to be part of that shift. I think that, IMR has been sort of the grand dame of migration research, and we're seeing a proliferation of journals focused on niches, on spaces dealing with migration. But I think it remains kind of I don't know if it's the captain, if you will, or whoever it is that charts the way of what solid migration research is, and it speaks to the need for interdisciplinary approaches, for approaches that can speak to mainstream scholarship that is not just about case studies of this place or that place. So I think IMR remains a sort of central reference point. And by diversifying the approaches, by trying to actively shift the content, bring in scholars and voices from elsewhere in the world who are engaged with some of the theories that have long been published in IMR, challenging it, but also proposing different ways of looking at migration. IMR still has a very powerful role to play in setting that agenda. It's a respected journal, and let's hope that it can chart a course within migration research that can keep it firmly in the academy, can continue to reach out to policy people, to activists, but can also help us to sort of problematize some of the presumptions that we've long held about what migration is and what it means.